you for everybody coming. It is a coincidence, of course, today that it's my birthday and we're raising money for a good cause. And I need to tell you, I've already left my donation check. People have been so generous that when they found out that the judge kind of threw the book at me, I need you to know I'm a bad person. So my friend Candy Stewart got a $500 fine, and I got the $1,500 fine. But people sent me money. So I just made a $1,000 donation there because I don't think your member parliament should make a profit on getting arrested, actually. So but I was really proud on March 23rd as I was standing there to suddenly see, you know, Tommy Mitchell and Mina Lee and so many people and Bryony. And I didn't know that people from the constituency were getting arrested on March 23rd. I had no idea, and they didn't know I would be there. So we were all there in Romilly. We were all there together, which was a very powerful experience. And this is my 64th birthday, so I had a clean record till I was, you know, I didn't. But I'd never been arrested my whole life, and some people thought I must have by now. I stood on the line in Clayoquot Sound in 1993, and I almost got arrested. But my friend Vicky Husband, she was really annoyed with me for planning to get arrested, and she said, "You can't." So I can. She said, "You can't. Wouldn't be good for Sierra Club." I said, "Well, I'm going to." She said, "You're still nursing." I have to say that kind of fixed me. I said, "Oh yeah, right." She said, "You think you're going to let the baby into prison?" I said, "Oh, okay." So I'm no longer nursing. Had no good reasons not to stand with the brave people who decided they were going to do this. And I made a decision at an anti-Kinder Morgan rally in Vancouver before the Trudeau administration approved the pipeline. And I think a lot of you were there that day too. There were thousands and thousands of people on the streets of Vancouver. And I listened to speech after speech, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, Chief Bob Chamberlain, just First Nations leadership from all over, and Mayor Gregor Roberts, and a whole bunch of people saying, if it comes to it, we'll stand on the line and face arrest. And the thing is, at that moment I realized I couldn't say anything other than that I would stand in solidarity. If First Nations leadership was going to be standing up and getting arrested, I knew I had to stand in solidarity. I have to say that at that point, I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I really felt that the case against Kinder Morgan was so strong that Justin Trudeau shouldn't approve it, especially since in the election he'd said that no project could be approved that went through a process as flawed as the NEB process that the Kinder Morgan pipeline went through. So I thought, okay, it's not going to be approved. But increasingly what I heard around Ottawa was a strange excuse for approving a pipeline that had gone through the most inadequate, flawed, rigged review I've ever seen, the National Energy Board review of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which was one of the first times in Canadian history, thanks to Bill C-38 that Harper brought in 2012, that the National Energy Board was doing the environmental assessment. They'd only done it once before. They did it on Enbridge. But on the Enbridge Northern Gateway project, they didn't have time limits, and they actually allowed people to cross-examine witnesses. As an intervener in the Kinder Morgan process, and I was accepted as an intervener in May 2014. Other than paper interrogatories and exchanges of paperwork, couldn't participate. As a matter of fact, as a member of parliament, I wasn't allowed in the room for 2 years. It wasn't until final argument, February 2016, I was allowed in the room as an intervener in the process. So my anger ran deep, but my knowledge of the information around the 23,000 pages of evidence Kinder Morgan had tabled, which wasn't really evidence, it was mostly to discourage anyone from reading what they put forward. So it was many, many pages that were redundant, repetitive, and so on. So I felt really engaged in this process. I'd done my homework, I'd done all the legal things, and I couldn't believe that there was any way in the world that the Trudeau administration would approve a pipeline that they'd run in the election saying it would have to go back to square one because the review process that it underwent was so inadequate that you couldn't make a decision based on that flawed review process. But the strange thing that I mentioned that I began to hear around Ottawa was, Rachel needs a pipeline. What? Rachel needs a pipeline. I said, well, well, Rachel may think she needs a pipeline, but Rachel needs refineries. I mean, what kind of an excuse is it for approving a project that makes no sense? Anyway, fast forward to March 23rd when I found out, I got the call that this was a time that they were asking for elected representatives to show up. I didn't know who was going to show up with me. And I thought, well, I've got to keep my promise. I gave my word to a lot of people that if it came to it, I would stand in solidarity. I didn't really want it to come to that. And if Justin Trudeau had kept his promise, it wouldn't have. So we ended up, a lot of us that day and more afterwards, standing up and saying, this is something we can't accept. The law may say that Kinder Morgan has a right to have an injunction against people blocking the gates. But another set of laws say that until the Federal Court of Appeal rules on the consolidated cases that were heard in October 2017, no one knows if those permits were issued legally or not. And that's a separate issue from whether the injunction was legal. So as somebody who used to practice law and who sits in Parliament of Canada, I have to respect that a judge issuing an injunction has done a legal thing, and that in breaking that judge's injunction, because of a whole set of other legal things, like are these permits legal? Can't we wait till the courts rule on whether Indigenous rights were in fact violated? Can't we wait till the court rules on whether the cases put forward by the cities of Vancouver and Burnaby are correct, which is the case I would have brought forward as a former intervener, that the whole process was a sham, that not being allowed to cross-examine witnesses meant that none of the evidence put for evidence, like amateur hour gong show stuff that wouldn't have gotten a passing grade in any university course. That's the evidence that Kinder Morgan put forward that Dilbit could be cleaned up. A study done one time only, over a 10-day period in Gainford, Alberta, in a tank full of water, to which they added salt and said, yo-ho, Salish Sea. Swear to God, I couldn't believe how bad Kinder Morgan's case was. And I couldn't believe how bad the National Energy Board was to refuse to hear the evidence. I don't know how many of you know this, that Unifor, the largest union in representing oil sands workers, intervened in the Kinder Morgan case against the pipeline. This malarkey that it creates jobs is so much, well, it's propaganda without evidence. And the NEB said, we refuse to hear the evidence of Unifor that pipeline completion will cost jobs in Canada because it's outside of our mandate at the National Energy Board to consider jobs. It's outside of our mandate at the National Energy Board to consider the economy. And therefore, we refuse to accept the evidence of Unifor. Like, why wasn't that a headline anywhere? So I know for a fact that when Jim Carr, our Minister of Natural Resources, and Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister, and Bill Morneau stand up and say, this pipeline's in the national interest, it'll create 15,000 jobs. No. According to Kinder Morgan, it will create 90 jobs. 40 in Alberta, 50 in BC. And during construction, 2,500 jobs a year for 2 years. There's no multiplier in the world that makes that 15,000 jobs. So the rage I feel over the nonsense that passes for facts in this country, and knowing that the case against these allegations from Kinder Morgan that their project is in the national interest, all of this is right now before the Federal Court of Appeal. That they violated First Nations rights, Indigenous rights, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Section 35 of the Constitution, as well as all the cases brought forward by environmental groups, that there's a statutory responsibility on the part of the federal government under the Species at Risk Act to turn down any project that threatens the extinction of a species that's listed as endangered. And our southern resident killer whale population is definitely on that list. So approving the project in the face of Department of Fisheries and Oceans evidence to the NEB that the project was a threat to the southern resident killer whales violated a statutory responsibility of the government. At least that's the case that was brought forward by Raincoast Foundation and a number of other groups. City of Burnaby, City of Vancouver brought forward the case that I would have brought forward, that the whole process was a sham, that not allowing cross-examination meant that the evidence was worthless, and that the NEB refused to take proper consideration of issues like climate change, and issues like you can't clean up Dilbit, and issues like it's far too dangerous to have 7 times more Aframax tankers loaded with Dilbit going through the straits out of Vancouver, the first narrowest bridge, the second narrowest bridge, and out through our waters between here, the Southern Gulf Islands, and the San Juan Islands. That's the case that's brought forward by Vancouver and Burnaby, and the case of Indigenous rights brought forward by many First Nations, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and others. The court can rule any day. So I want to share with you one thing really, really clearly. This pipeline will never be built. And that's based on the law. So here I am as someone who broke an injunction. I know I did. I'm sorry for those constituents, and there are a number who are angry because they don't think their member of parliament should have violated an injunction. But the reality is the permits that Kinder Morgan had with which they went to the court to get that injunction are not yet ruled to be legal or illegal. And at some point soon, the Federal Court of Appeal, 3-person bench that heard all those arguments. Can you imagine 15 different plaintiffs, each legal case raising 10 to 20 different legal points? The Federal Court of Appeal consolidated all those cases and heard them all together in what was, by the way, the longest hearing in the history of the Federal Court of Canada in October of 2017. Someday soon, that decision is going to come down. And all I can do is hope and pray that it's going to say what it should say, which is the permits were granted illegally and they no longer exist. You need to know that, because at that point protests can stop. All of our efforts can move towards saying, what do you do now, Justin Trudeau? You just bought a project with a permit you granted, which was granted illegally. Best idea is to scrap it and walk away. And we should walk away from the sale, by the way. $4.5 billion, think of all the things $4.5 billion can buy in this country. Removing all the drinking water advisories in First Nations communities. That would take a couple billion and we'd have a few billion in change. So we know that buying, oh, by the way, why did we buy something that wasn't ever an issue? Have you thought about that? I mean, the issue supposedly was that Kinder Morgan had trouble building their expansion on the new pipeline. We bought the old pipeline. Why did we buy the old pipeline? You're probably wondering, so I'm going to rant a little longer and then I'll stop. We bought the old pipeline because Kinder Morgan, I hope everybody here knows that Richard Kinder was a senior executive at Enron. And if Ken Lay had picked Richard Kinder, who was in line to be the CEO, lucky SOB, because if Richard Kinder had been picked instead of Jeffrey Skillings, when Enron went down, it would have been Richard Kinder in jail instead of Jeffrey Skillings. Instead, Richard Kinder was left standing. And what did he own when Enron disappeared? He owned Enron Pipelines Limited. That was the name of the company. And then they went out and bought other pipelines, and they changed the name to Kinder Morgan. And a lot of the executives are former Enron guys. So anyway, they bought Trans Mountain, which was built by a Canadian company to deliver crude to it, and they built it in 1953. At one point, they had 4 refineries in Burnaby where people were working decent jobs in Burnaby. It wasn't for export. It was for use in the lower mainland and throughout BC. They were producing gasoline and diesel and propane and so on. We're down to 1 refinery left. It used to be owned by Chevron. Last year, it was sold to a company called Parkland. If anyone tries to tell you the price of gas is high here because of the carbon tax increase or because we don't have the Kinder Morgan pipeline, it's because Parkland was just doing upgrades and changes to their refinery in the first quarter of this year. So the Parkland refinery in Burnaby has not been producing much gasoline at all, so we've had to be buying it from the States. If Kinder Morgan's expansion goes through, according to the evidence from Unifor that the NEB refused to hear, that refinery will close because it won't have access to crude it can use to refine, because all that Kinder Morgan wants to pump through the expansion is dilbit, which can't be processed by any refinery. Well, there's a few in Alberta and 1 in Saskatchewan, but otherwise no refinery in Canada can process bitumen. So here we are knowing that the only reason that Canada suddenly decided to buy out a pipeline company, create a crown corporation, and start running it was that Kinder Morgan, bear in mind, Enron background, decided they wanted to get out of the Kinder Morgan expansion because it had no investors, has no market, and doesn't make sense economically. But they have some contracts that won't go well with them due to penalties. This is all research Robin Allen dug up. So go Google Robin Allen and this research. So what are they going to do? They want to cancel the Kinder Morgan expansion because it makes no sense. And by the way, the tell on this, the proof that they decided some time ago they weren't interested in really building the expansion, is that when they went out on the market to raise money for the expansion project, which they say is $7.4 billion, last year they raised about $1.7 billion towards building the expansion. Right? What do they do with the money? Richard Kinder told his shareholders in a conference call, and his conversation is taped, where he says, "We used it to pay down debt of the parent company." And then they spun off Kinder Morgan Canada as a separate corporation with a corporate wall between the two of them. And then they said, Kinder Morgan is Canada, and it has no money, so they have to start raising money again because the $1.7 billion they raised earlier, they used to pay down debt. Pretty clear sign they never intended to build the pipeline. So they took their own project hostage. They put forward a ransom, but they're very unusual kidnappers. They didn't want the ransom money. On May 31st, they wanted to shoot the hostage. Justin Trudeau didn't want that because it would make it look like he couldn't save the hostage. So that's why we bought it. A 65-year-old pipeline that was never part of the fix, never part of the debate. $4.5 billion pipeline that in 2007, Kinder Morgan estimated to the NEB was worth $550 million. So, stupid, yes, in large letters flashing in neon. Not a good economic move. More money than they've ever spent on fighting for climate action to buy an old pipeline with a promise to build the new one. It'll never happen. But one of the reasons it'll never happen is because we're all standing up. So, thank you for standing up. And no one arrested on Salt Spring Island, no one arrested across British Columbia, nobody arrested at Kinder Morgan's gates should end up feeling financial burdens from those fines. Thank you for donating tonight. I have to leave and catch a ferry. Love you so much. Haishka Siam.